Greetings, Isaiah Seminar classmates. This evening I'm going to do a video review of the article by Ulrich Berges, and it's entitled The Fourth Servant Song, referring to Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12, and reflections on the current debate of the symbolism of the cross from the perspective of the Old Testament. So I want you to think of the phrase, history is written by the victors. What have you heard about it? What do you think about it? And how might it relate to the suffering servant passage, along with Christianity's perspective and outside of Christianity's perspective on this timeless passage? Scholar Ulrich Berges explores the complicated nature of the symbol of the cross in historical, contemporary, social, and academic context. He firmly believes the Christian tradition cannot be the sole source to solve these disputes, since the harm, hurt, and confusion stretches beyond the Christian tradition itself. He states one of his primary reasons for doing such, quote, "The function of theological scholarship is, after all, not only or primarily to provide ecclesiastical self-reinsurance, but also to inject the value of its own religious tradition into the free social discourse, to discursively fluidize them, not to dilute them." Berges starts off as an examination of the cross in the contemporary and political sphere. He states of the European Court of Human Rights agreeing upon the cross being more than a cultural symbol, but a specific religious sign that influences children in schools and other settings. There were several cases that related to this in previous decades, though the ECHR case is one of the most notable for Berges. While this may have been influential in what Berges calls the Christian West, there are further concerns that must be addressed. Islamic scholar Navid Kermani brings up several valid points that influence Berges' arguments. Much of these arguments revolve around the understanding of suffering and the cross. One of the most influential responses to Kermani came from Lutheran pastor and Peace Prize winner of the German book trade in 1993, Friedrich Schlemmer. Schlemmer postulates the provocative question, what kind of God is it who needs his son's sacrifice to have mercy on us? In conclusion to this contemporary overview, Berges lays out the groundwork for his Old Testament comparison of the suffering of the cross and the current debate of the symbolism of the cross. He fiercely claims that Jesus of Nazareth's vicariously suffering death is not an assumed fact or connection by early interpreters and witnesses at the time of the suffering servant and Jesus' life. Furthermore, he claims the New Testament does not directly lead one to interpret the death of Jesus as having vicarious suffering. The numerous New Testament passages often connected to Isaiah 53 should not be assumed to have the same cultural context or meaning. The discourse of the comparison of Jesus and the suffering servant of God of Isaiah 53 begins with the necessary explanation of the title. The title, which states, Jesus and the suffering servant of God of Isaiah 53, contains the key phrase, and. It is not or, maybe, or even possibly the suffering servant of God. The use of and attempts to begin the discussion with the distinction of two separate subjects that by certain contemporary scholars have been overlapped or at worst conflated with one another instead of being seen in their own individual perspective and history. Berges' questions, which I summarize, ask, did the early Christians recognize him outright to be the servant of God as portrayed as Isaiah? This leads to other important discussions and things to process. While there are many scriptural examples that would reinforce the argument within the question posed by Berges, there are specific cases that would stand out. For example, Psalm 22 was omitted by two of the four gospel writers, Luke and John. Psalm 22, which states, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I find this particularly peculiar because Luke and John are far more exhaustive in length and detail than the book of Mark displays. Berges asks yet another provocative question. Why did the evangelists, meaning Luke and John, balk at representing Jesus and his passion and death as the suffering servant of God of Isaiah 53? He argues that several explanations for this are incorrect, inadequate, or unlikely because all four gospel authors would very likely know of the Psalm 22 reference. To further aid his point earlier, he claims, there is no mention of vicarious suffering for others. He argues that much of this confusion and random representation of vicarious suffering comes from Greek translation efforts because this conclusion is not easily represented in earlier biblical text. He concludes that the most important point is not merely the lack of biblical connection between Isaiah 53 and the crucifixion, but what the suffering actually involves. Berges claims the suffering, quote, deals not with the vicarious suffering, but with the innocent suffering of the righteous man. This nurtures the hope of God. The righteous one will save the righteous man and see that justice is done. He also concludes that, quote, an individual messianic interpretation was not paramount to any degree. The Isaiah 53 passage is more aimed to illustrate the collective suffering of Israel, not the suffering of Christ. In Old Testament perspective, Isaiah 53 leads Berges to several conclusions. Based on other scholarly research, Berges does not support a single author theory of the three proposed sections of Isaiah. Berges proposes regarding the authorship of Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, and Trito-Isaiah are most likely written by a school or group of writers versus a single author for each section. He suggests there is a group of educated literates who carried on the narratives of Isaiah. This has been proposed by several other scholars we have studied in this course. The authors hailed from either the Isaiah ben Amos tradition or such credibility was gained through the Oratio of Hope by linking itself to a time-honored representation of the Isaiah tradition. There are many themes throughout the suffering servant, but Berges contests who the audience and subject of the suffering is. The concept of the collectiveness or collective suffering mentioned earlier comes into play again in Berges' argument. He couches his argument that many times in the Old Testament that, quote, when the Old Testament speaks of individual persons, frequently entire groups are meant. Berges contends that, quote, we, that is mentioned in Isaiah 53, is gravely misunderstood. The we belongs to the people of God, not a sole individual experiencing vicarious suffering. Berges concludes, quote, these marked people are stricken by God, not to atone for their own sin, but to pay for the iniquities of others. One of the final reasons that Berges and other scholars speculate the confusion between Christ and the suffering servant is the need for the victory narrative. Berges claims that much of this understanding in contemporary context is because of the violence that has been done in the name of the cross in order to preserve its power and legacy as being a legitimate form of belief. We choose to ascribe to the collective guilt rather than collective redemption that the Isaiah 53 narrative promotes. So to give just a brief overview of what we presented, the crossfire of the cross in the public sphere, Jesus and the suffering servant of God, Isaiah 53 from an Old Testament perspective, and inferences for the current discussion. If you're interested in more theories involving atonement theory, I would highly recommend several books. One of this is The Crucifixion, The Understanding of the Death of Jesus Christ by Fleming Rutledge. And then Andrew Root has a great one from Princeton Press talking about atonement with youth students. And finally, Greg Boyd has theories of atonement text that is a really excellent read. If you have any questions about that, please shoot me an email or get back to me in another form of communication. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed it and were challenged by the work of Berges as I was. Thank you.